Hello everyone, my name is Preston Dennett, and thank you for joining me for a new episode of UFOs and the Paranormal. I truly appreciate it. Got a great episode for you today, I certainly hope so. I'm going to be talking about humanoids. I call this episode The Sky People. 6 seriously strange encounters with humanoids. These are not just grays, these are definitely all kinds of humanoids. And when I say seriously unusual, I'm not kidding. These cases are off the charts bizarre. These cases come from all over the world, including Argentina, Australia, Brazil, England, Italy, and one from the United States, Nebraska. And yeah, each of these cases is so unusual. I think they provide unique insights and provide more information to help us really understand the extraterrestrial presence on our planet. I also have one case which actually I was able to obtain a recorded testimony from the witness himself. So that's a real treat. Let's get started. First case I want to talk about today, I call a spaceship from another world. This one occurred one day in 1958 in Belem, Argentina. It's a fantastic case because the witness has great credentials and describes his experience in details and was able to have a very long conversation with this apparent extraterrestrial. This case was published in Argentine newspapers but has not been widely publicized. The sole witness is Fernando Arquibola Garcia. He is a radio and electronics technician and professor of electronics at a public school and an inventor, including inventing electronic thermometers. So a great witness. It was around 4 a.m. one morning in January of 1958 that Fernando, age 42, packed up a donkey and traveled about 8 kilometers south of the small city of Belem. This is at the location of the San Antonio tungsten mine in the desert. He was actually on a prospecting and surveying mission in search of minerals. And he arrived at his destination around 7 a.m. and began his search. Again, this is a very remote area. It was around noon that he stopped to rest and have lunch, and this is when he began to hear a strange intermittent buzzing noise. He went to investigate, but the buzzing sound stopped and he saw nothing unusual, at least at first. But hearing it again, he now realized it was coming from a small ravine ahead of him, and continuing to look around, he saw, quote, something that puzzled me. About 300 feet away in front of him in this little ravine was a weird structure. He first thought it might be some kind of secret government or military building, but he was puzzled because there was not supposed to be anything there. This object was sitting on a tripod landing gear and had windows situated evenly around the perimeter. It appeared to be almost 100 feet long and about 65 feet high, and it had a matte olive green color. So curious, he began to approach closer, and he got to within about 200 feet when he saw what he describes as a periscope-type device emerge from the top section of this structure. So he now became even more nervous, as he knew that stumbling upon a secret military operation could be dangerous, as they might, quote, shoot first and ask questions later. So he stopped where he stood and just looked. It was about 1 minute later that a figure appeared. Now this figure was unusual. It was over 6 feet tall and dressed in what appeared to be a white asbestos suit with a visor. This is how Fernando described it. But he was too far away from this figure to see any facial features through this visor, and as Fernando says, we stared at each other for a few seconds, and that's when I heard some sort of birds chirping in my mind. Instantly, I heard a voice in my head speaking impeccable Spanish, without an accent. He ordered me to stop and asked who I was. So Fernando, hearing this, telepathically in his head, shouted out his name and said that he had been assigned to search this area, and then he asked the strange figure, "What is that building? Who does it belong to?" And then he said, "I was given no warning that there were military installations here." Now the being responded, but not in the way Fernando expected. As he says, I got something like a mocking smile. The amazing thing is that I was about 70 meters, 230 feet, away from the individual, and I heard him as if I were 1 meter away. The figure replied, apparently telepathically, it's not any ground military installation. So Fernando now wondered if perhaps it was a Navy structure and asked if he could walk to the other side of what he still assumed was some kind of building. But the being replied, do not move from there. As Fernando says, the being took a thing, a kind of flashlight, and pointed it at a rock. A bright white beam came out of the lantern and struck the stone, located 30 meters away. In a matter of seconds, the rock melted away. I felt scared. That was certainly a show of strength, and I stayed still, naturally. For a few seconds, there was nothing but silence. After this, Fernando asked the being, what kind of weapon is that? And the man replied, pure energy. And then he pointed to this craft and asked, why do you think that is a military facility? And Fernando replied, because of the olive green color. It looks like a research laboratory. Again, Fernando perceived mentally a kind of mocking smile, and the man told him that it was a non-human spacecraft and added, quote, we've had technical difficulties, but they will be resolved shortly. So Fernando continued to talk to this figure and asked him, was the buzzing sound I heard due to those technical issues? The man replied in the affirmative. Now Fernando studied the craft with new eyes, looking for an engine or exhaust pipes or anything that would betray its aeronautical nature, but there were none. So again, Fernando mentally sensed a mocking smile, and the man, as if reading his mind, replied, the propulsion system is not known to you, and told him that it was inside the craft. Now, Fernando recalled that during his time of employment in the United States earlier, he had heard about UFOs, and now looking at the craft, he could see it was actually more disc-shaped than anything, and again, as if reading his thoughts, the ET replied, it's been over 20,000 years since we visited your planet. Fernando asked him, where do you come from? And what followed was about 2 hours per Fernando of a telepathic conversation with this being. As Fernando says, he claimed that they came from our galaxy, from a planetary system with 2 suns, one larger than the other. I was given a set of coordinates so that I might pinpoint their location on any star chart of our galaxy. I asked the name of the suns and the planet, but I didn't understand their words. I requested to get on the ship. I was curious, and he replied, do you claim to be 600 years old overnight? This puzzled Fernando, and he asked, what do you mean? And the ET replied, what you can see inside there is unintelligible to your mind. We are separated by 50,000 years of civilization. And the man proceeded to elaborate on this concept. As Fernando says, he gave me an example, the mayfly. He lives for 8 hours on Earth, he explained. If he is born at 8 in the morning, he dies at 4 in the afternoon. That is, it goes through childhood, youth, and maturity in 8 hours. That is the time of human beings regarding us. We talked about other matters, Atlantis, the Egyptian Sphinx, the speed of light. Then he indicated to hide behind the brake, throw myself down to the ground and cover my ears. So I did it, and I felt the buzz again, but sharper, and I noticed a strong pressure in my head. The pressure lasted for half a minute. I looked up and saw the quote building about 300 meters high. It was shaped lenticularly, and it shone like metal. It was motionless in space. Above, it was glowing in a blood red. Seconds later, it headed northwest and disappeared from sight. I was very impressed. Now, researchers, of course, later talked to Fernando and asked him to explain more in depth what the ETs said about Atlantis. And as Fernando says, it was inhabited by creatures almost 4 meters high. It was an island in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. A seismic collapse made it disappear. Now regarding the Sphinx, Fernando says that the ETs said that thousands of years ago, another one of their ships landed in Egypt when people were dying of an epidemic. The ETs helped them, saving many lives, and as a thanks, the ancient Egyptians erected the Sphinx to honor one of the female ETs who was organizing the rescue. Now, Fernando freely told his story and did agree to have his name used. He wanted to talk about it, as he disagreed with the UFO cover-up. As Fernando says, "I have no fear of ridicule. Why shouldn't there be other inhabited worlds? And also because of the repeated absurd denials issued by U.S. investigative committees regarding the possibility of extraterrestrial intelligence. Furthermore, if everyone has the right to ask me questions, I in turn have the same right to ask, by what logic is the existence of other worlds with civilizations more advanced than ours deemed impossible?" How amazing is that? There are a number of cases where ETs said that they're having trouble with their craft and are trying to repair it. And here's another one. Also so interesting is that these apparent ETs were able to provide all kinds of information about Earth's ancient history, the pyramids and the Sphinx and this sort of thing. We don't hear that often. It does come up, but it's certainly fascinating. Really interesting also that this gentleman had such high credentials. Makes me wonder if perhaps they contacted him intentionally. He didn't jump to the ET explanation initially. I think that that gives the case a little bit more credibility. I'm really glad he had the courage and strength to step forward and tell his story publicly, because again, when someone is willing to stand behind their account, that also adds another level of credibility to it. An amazing case. So now let's move to the next one. Also really, really unusual. I call this one, "We Are the Sky People." This one occurred actually over a series of days in July of 1965 in Windang, New South Wales, Australia. It's a multiple witness case, which is so unusual it deserves to be well known. This next case was investigated in depth by researcher Omar Fowler of the Phenomenon Research Association, Derbyshire, and he was also a consultant for the Flying Saucer Review. The witnesses are a married couple, Derek and Dora Smith. That's a pseudonym for both of them. Researcher Omar Fowler knows them personally, and he interviewed them 4 times about their amazing encounter. Their encounter began in 1963 after they moved with their 3 children from England to Australia, eventually settling in Windang in New South Wales, Australia. The family were fans of old English comedy shows aired on the radio, and as they were listening to their favorite show one evening, they began to notice a, quote, static. The static interfered with their radio transmission, sometimes blanking out their show completely. The strange thing was, the static seemed to occur the same exact time each week. So they became curious about what might be causing this static, and they decided to go outside in the evening at the time the radio was staticking up. And to their surprise, they saw strange star-like objects moving across the sky. And as these objects moved closer, both Derek and Dora used binoculars and were able to discern a sort of dart-like shape to these objects. These objects would occasionally flash blue or pink, and both became convinced that the objects were genuine UFOs. Now, both were very interested in psychic phenomena, and having prior used a Ouija board to contact spirits, Dora had the idea that next time the objects appeared, they should try to contact the UFO occupants using telepathy and a homemade Ouija board. So Derek agreed. At the appointed time, when they expected static on the radio and the appearance of the objects, they were ready. Sure enough, the static started as expected, and the couple, using a wine glass as a pointer and a piece of paper for the Ouija board, placed their hands on the wine glass. Immediately, the wine glass seemed to move of its own accord and spelled out the word Z, Z-I. So they both asked, "Who is Z?" The response was immediate, and the board spelled out, "We are the Sky People." Both Derek and Dora were amazed, Derek in particular, as he had recently been studying the Australian Aborigine legends of the sky beings. Now, interestingly, in Chinese, the word Z can mean child or seed or graceful and beautiful, and is actually also used as an honorific for ancient philosophers. Don't know if there's a connection there. In English, the word Z has also been used as a gender-neutral pronoun. I just say this as a quick aside. At any rate, Derek and Dora asked a few more questions and the session ended. But following this, they began regular communications with the alleged sky people about twice a week. And through the Ouija board, Derek asked the sky people why they were visiting Earth. They replied that they were, quote, guardians of our planet, and that they have been visiting the planet for thousands of years and had actually landed here many times. Derek asked where they lived, and their reply was, quote, closer than you think. Derek and Dora asked if the sky people had names, and they replied that they did not have names like Earth people do, which they thought was very strange, but that they actually used, quote, titles, and these titles changed according to their tasks. Now, after several communications like this, Derek and Dora asked if they could have a face-to-face meeting with the sky people, and the ETs declined and said, quote, no, you would be frightened of us. And Derek thought, why would we be afraid? And as if reading his mind, the ETs replied again through the Ouija board, because we are bigger than you. So while Derek and Dora had initially felt some fear during the beginnings of the communications, they were no longer afraid. Derek felt confident that they were friendly, and over the next few weeks, he repeatedly asked for a meeting. After several requests, the sky people finally agreed and instructed the couple that at the next scheduled flyover, the couple should go to a particular location on the shoreline of Lake Illawarra, this is very close to their house, and go to a small clearing in the woods at the edge of the lake, and the ETs would make an appearance. So this was just a few days away, and as the appointed meeting time approached, both Derek and Dora were excited and also slightly apprehensive. Dora in particular wondered if they were perhaps opening themselves up to being taken by the ETs. But the appointed time arrived, the children were safely tucked into bed, and Derek and Dora set off to the lake just a short distance away. Now, arriving at the spot, they were dismayed to see a light aircraft which was flying backwards and forwards across the lake, circling as if searching for something. So they wondered naturally if word of their ET rendezvous had somehow leaked out and the plane had scared the sky people away. The plane eventually left. The couple remained at the lake for some time, but the so-called sky people never showed up, and they returned home. Back in their home, they immediately tried again to contact the sky people through the Ouija board, but there was no response. So they waited until the next flyover was due and again reached out via the board and asked, where were you? The sky people replied, quote, not come, spotter plane, go now to agreed place. So surprised, Derek and Dora quickly prepared and set off to the predetermined location. They quickly reached the spot and almost immediately, Dora grabbed Derek's arm and pointed. She told him, quote, he's over there by the tree. There was a very large tree on the edge of the clearing that was clearly visible, and Dora, who had better eyesight than Derek, could clearly see a tall, shadowy figure. Derek was also able to see it, and per them, this figure appeared to be tall and slim and wearing a one-piece black jumpsuit. Both Dora and Derek felt a sense of paralysis, immobility, which they thought was caused either by their own fear or perhaps an outside force. They really weren't sure which. After just a few moments, the figure seemed to put its hands towards its midsection as if touching its belt, and it promptly disappeared. Dora shouted out, he's gone. The couple was now able to move freely. They briefly discussed what they had seen and returned home. The next day, they returned to the spot and walked up to this tree where they had seen the strange figure. Dora pointed to a projection on the tree trunk and explained that the being's head had reached that height, and both were amazed to see that this would have made the figure about 8 feet tall, which certainly aligned with what this being had told them, that they were very, very large. So that was pretty much the end of their communications with the so-called sky people, but there was one final appearance. It was one evening, just a short time after this meeting, that a horrendous storm struck the area. The storm actually knocked out the electricity to their home, and was powerful enough to rip leaves and branches from the surrounding trees. Derek wanted to go outside and see if he could check the breakers and fix the power loss, but the storm was too intense. He did look out the window, and as the lightning flashed, he was amazed to see what he believed was the same figure, just a dark silhouette standing by the window. Now, he thought he may have been mistaken, but immediately after seeing this, mysteriously, the electricity to the house was restored. So the next morning, after the storm had passed, Derek went outside to the corner of the house to check on the electrical trip switch that was there, and he saw a dark sooty area where the power surge had taken place. Not only had the trip switch been reconnected, but as investigator Omar Fowler writes, quote, "There was a sooty outline, that of a hand, a very large hand." It wasn't long after this that the couple ended up moving back to England. This was surprising because they had intended to make Australia their permanent home. They had previously used the Ouija board before their encounters, and it had told them that they would be moving back to England at some point. They hadn't believed it, but of course, the Ouija board turned out to be correct. How amazing is that? What starts out with a sighting ends up as a full-blown face-to-face encounter with a very unusual humanoid. Technically, I think this would qualify as a close encounter of the fifth kind, given that the witnesses reached out to the ETs telepathically and bizarrely through a Ouija board. I know how unusual that sounds, but it's not unique. In fact, I did a whole episode on people who encountered UFOs and ETs using a Ouija board. I personally wouldn't recommend it for obvious reasons, but yeah, these cases do turn up, and here's another one. All right, let's move on to the next case. This one's a bit concerning in some ways. I call this one the aliens in the meadow. This is a multiple witness case which occurred one evening in January of 1966 in Shipston-on-Store, England. It's a really unusual case for sure, as we shall soon see. This case first appeared in the Northern UFO News, issue number 108, in an article titled, quote, "A Meeting with Aliens." This was written by researcher Jeff Bird, who investigated and interviewed the witness. The witness to this case is anonymous and is known only by his initials, D.W. He was formerly a member of the English police force, but at the time of his encounter, he was working as a cabaret musician. He was 48 years old. It was just after 1 a.m. one evening in January 1966. The exact date is not given, but D.W. was driving to his home at Reading after a show near Walsall. He was on the A34 road, not far from Shipston-on-Stores, on a quiet roadway. Along with him was a child by the name of Philip. This is an 11-year-old boy who was a member of D.W.'s extended family. So D.W. parked the car along the road during this journey to enjoy a quick snack, and this is when suddenly 11-year-old Philip noticed a brilliant light in the meadow off to the side of the road. Now, D.W. had traveled this route enough times to know that there was no structure there, so he suggested that Philip go investigate. Philip was too frightened to leave the car, so D.W. stepped out and looked over the hedge bordering the road, and he could now see that the light was coming from a strange object, which appeared to be sitting on the ground in the meadow or hovering just above it. This object appeared to be just over 300 feet away from the witnesses, on a slight downslope leading away from the road. Now, this object was unusual. It was bullet-shaped, vertically oriented with the flat end on the ground and the point facing upwards. It was metallic silver and had a vertical band or marking in the center. There was a bright blue light on the top, which appeared to be revolving slowly, sending a blue beam of light around the field onto the ground. And as DW watched the blue beam rotating, it suddenly illuminated two figures who were standing in the meadow next to the craft. The humanoids were unusual. They were very tall, dressed in full-body jumpsuits, which seemed to reflect or glow with light. Both figures were staring at the ground next to the craft. So DW watched this for just a few moments. With a growing curiosity about these strange beings and the craft, he decided to move beyond the hedge, and he began to walk down the slope towards the craft. Now, unknown to him, 11-year-old Philip watched DW move away from the road, and apparently concerned or curious about where he was going, Philip exited the car and peered over the hedge. And seeing the strange craft and beings, and his only companion heading straight for them, Philip screamed. Immediately, as if in response, the blue beam of light emanating from the top of the craft swung around and struck both the witnesses and their car. Philip became immediately hysterical, and DW, now in a state of panic, turned around and fled back to the vehicle, pushing Philip inside, and tried to drive away. All this time, Philip clung fearfully to DW, making it very difficult for him to manage the vehicle, but he released the handbrake, which allowed the car to roll of its own accord down the hill on the road until DW was able to start the engine. And he drove away in a blind panic, finally reaching the city of Oxford around 2:45 a.m. They both felt great relief to be back around people. They drove on to Reading and immediately called a doctor to check on Philip, who was still in a state of shock. The doctor prescribed a sedative. Now Philip was still afraid, and he begged DW not to travel that route again the next day as was planned. But DW reassured him that it would be daylight and he would be fine. So DW took the same route. He returned to the location and inspected the ground where he had seen the craft. And there he found a large black circle of scorched grass. He also saw a strange silvery powder in the circle. Now, according to investigator Jeff Bird, he writes that DW was very emotional as he described the encounter to him, particularly because DW's sister's boyfriend and 11-year-old Philip were both killed in a tragic auto accident. Now, DW also claimed that following the encounter, he was diagnosed with a brain tumor, which he links somehow to the encounter, particularly being struck by this beam of light. The tumor was successfully removed, but it did leave DW with some brain damage and emotional problems, which made it impossible for him to continue his work as a cabaret musician. Now, while this case rests solely on the testimony of DW, investigators to the case said that they found the witness, quote, likable and genuinely sincere. They also noted that DW, like many contactees, reported, quote, several other psychic phenomena. It's very sad that there was such a tragic ending to this case with one of the witnesses dying in an auto accident. Very sad and quite unfortunate that the investigators were not able to get his testimony as well. But an important case, given that there were what appear to be serious medical effects, though that's not proven. The witness certainly thinks so, but it's very hard to say for sure. It's a shame that the landing traces that the witness describes weren't studied. This turns up over and over again. Witnesses describe incredible landing traces, but they are not photographed or studied by a professional investigator, which to me is a real lost opportunity. Because people often say, oh, there's no evidence. Well, yeah, there is. There's a lot of evidence. So an important case. Now let's move to the next one, which is, I think, by far my favorite case. It is so unusual. This witness is so credible. He reported his encounter immediately after it happened, which is really important because we know a person's memory can fade over time. But I call this one, I had the most unbelievable thing happen tonight. This occurred on the evening of September 14, 1978 in Belem, Nebraska. And I've got quite a bit to say about this case, but let's just get to it first. This case first appeared in the December 1978 issue of the APRO Bulletin in an article by APRO field investigator Dave Kenny titled CE3 Encounter in Nebraska. It was also reported to the National UFO Reporting Center, NUFORC, then headed by Robert Gribble. And I'll be playing excerpts of this conversation with Robert Gribble throughout this case. But in Dave Kenny's article, the witness is anonymous. As Dave Kenny says, the witness is a prominent, highly respected businessman whose name is familiar to nearly everyone in the Los Angeles area. But thanks to the NUFORC recording, again, which I will play excerpts of here, we now know that the man's name is Robert Stewart Estes. He was then the president of the Motor Car Dealers of Southern California and the founding father of the United States Auto Club, also a mechanical engineer, a pilot, and a veteran of World War II. And he did say it's okay to use his name. It was about 9 p.m. on September 14, 1978, that Robert, then age 65, was driving a rental car west on Interstate 20 in Nebraska. He had just passed through the small town of Belem and was heading towards Randolph when he saw an extremely bright object descending from the sky. He thought at first it might be a meteor, but then he thought perhaps a helicopter with floodlights, but he quickly realized that neither of these explanations were correct. And here, Robert describes the beginning of his encounter and what the object looked like. This is Robert explaining his encounter in his own words.
President of the Motor Car Dealers of Southern California. I was here back in Washington, D.C. on a mission, and I came down to some farmland that I've had something to do with my family for many years. I had the most unbelievable thing happen tonight, and I'm sober, and I was driving between Sioux City, Iowa, and Belem when the machine came out of the sky and sat down next to me, and I can describe it to you, to draw you a picture, and I'm a mechanical engineer with a lot of authority, believe me, and this is unbelievable, right alongside of me, and I'm a mechanical engineer, and I know machinery, and it was a Caterpillar type thing with a belt drive, and it wasn't there very long, but long enough for me to get a good look at it. It was at least 25 feet long. There were no airfoils, nothing that would connect it with air travel. You know, it looked like a big World War tractor, a tank, if you would like. And it was, you know, sort of belt-driven and wheels, and it was a big machine. It was at least 25 feet long, and yet there was no indication of any airfoil activity right next to me. Well, it almost pushed me off the road.
So Robert then stopped his car about 60 feet from the object, but as he says, the object practically drove him off the road. He started to open the door and get out for a closer look, but he had no sooner opened the door to his car and had one foot on the ground when something incredible happened. Again, here Robert describes in his own words what happened next.
Man got out of this goddamn thing and even spoke to me. He just said, "Bob, what do you think of this?" Spoke to me that knew me. Just that one thing, just jumped out of the thing and looked at me and said, "Bob, what do you think of this?" That was it. And then it took off. You may think I'm crazy or something. This did happen. Well, it was almost soundless. It was sort of a swishing noise, but that was it.
How strange is that? In the interview with investigator Dave Kenny, Robert did provide more detail and said that the man he encountered looked entirely human. He had dark hair, was of normal size and height, he wore white duck pants and a white shirt. After looking at Bob and saying, "Well, Bob, what do you think of this?" the man immediately returned into the object. The door closed, the object made a high-pitched whining sound, almost soundless, sort of a whooshing sound, and took off. For Robert, the light was so intense that he could not look at it directly and had to shield his eyes as this object ascended. Now, Robert does not really remember getting back into the car. This is what he told the APRO researcher. The next thing he recalls, he was back in the car driving down the road as this strange object followed him. And again, I'd like to play a brief portion of the audio tape where Robert describes his encounter.
Well, the only problem that I had was in my own direction and trying to get to where I was going. Yeah, I was well, whether I was confused and I thought, well, and there were lights that followed me for a period of time that frightened me. I thought, well, God, you're never going to make it.
So Robert tried to outrun the UFO, but it stayed right behind him, and it was then that he realized that he was on an entirely different road. He knew this area very well, as his family had property in the area since the turn of the century. To his amazement, he found that he was actually heading south on Route 57, just south of Hartington. This was some 12 or 15 miles north of where he had seen the UFO only moments earlier. So he raced south at very high speeds, up to 90, 95 miles per hour, he said. He soon reached Interstate 20 and again headed west, reaching the initial spot where he had first seen the UFO. Reaching this spot, the object immediately zoomed off. Now, Robert also describes a very important detail, what researchers now call the Oz factor. This involves a strange sense of isolation, an eerie silence, a lack of traffic, and Robert, the witness, describes this perfectly. And again, I'll just play a brief section of audio tape where he talks about this.
No, the strange thing was that there was all other traffic had stopped. And even after that, there was a minority of, it was almost like everything had been shut off. Well, I really couldn't say that because I was just, driving and it was kind of late. But I would say that there was a difference.
So after the encounter, Robert reached his destination around 11 p.m. And again, while he does not believe he experienced any missing time, 2 hours seems a bit late considering that his recall of the actual sighting is really quite brief. Arriving at his hotel room, he immediately called the Sioux City Police Department, who after hearing his story, suggested that he call Newfork, the National UFO Reporting Center, which he immediately did. In his call to Newfork, Robert Estes said that he did not want to be anonymous and that he was okay with his name being used. But after being contacted by APRO field investigator Dave Kenny, who conducted a more thorough interview, Robert did request anonymity. Investigator Dave Kenny was very impressed by the account and by the witness himself. As the investigator says, "The incident is an example of a truly incredible event reported by a totally credible witness. The witness had previously not had any particular interest in UFOs, and in view of his position and reputation in the business community, he obviously has much to lose and nothing to gain by revealing his experience. His sincerity and firm conviction of the reality of the incident are evidenced by the considerable time and effort he spent in getting his report to the proper people and by the detailed notes of the event that he made while they were still fresh in his memory." Now, one possible connection is that Dave Estes reports that he had just had a meeting in Washington, D.C. earlier that day. And again, he wonders if there might be a connection between that and his encounter.
Well, I'm not some nut calling in but I feel that this should be reported because, goddamn, I have a lot of people working for me. I'm a citizen. I've been involved in technical things all of my life, but God, I could not believe this. But this is amazing to me, what happened to me, and I'm just wondering if what kind of reports or if this has happened before. So I'm not a nut. I'm still in a state of shock, if it's the truth, and I'm not a nut or anything, but I felt that this should be reported. I'm an engine man, but God, I was so shocked. I could almost draw a picture of what this thing was done. I have felt that there's more to this than we know, but I'm certainly not trying to publicize it, if you know. Well, I would like to know further, believe me. This was such an experience that is so shocking. And if it happened to me, or why did it happen to me, or was it something that I had to do in Washington, or, you know, God, I can't believe it. And I'm not a dreamer. This is the most amazing thing that somebody came out and spoke to me and said, Bob, what do you think? You know, if I were drunk or something, or, you know, but this is too real. Well, I was so shocked, you know, it happened so quickly.
First, I want to say how very cool it was to hear directly this recorded testimony from the witness himself. That, I think, is really important because this way we know that this gentleman is describing exactly what happened to him. Also, he reported it so soon after his encounter. I mean, literally less than an hour after it occurred, he was talking to researchers. And what an amazing witness. Not only famous, but very well educated, a pilot, a veteran, someone who's very into machines and cars. And I think that provides a clue as to what this encounter might be all about. Because remember, he visited Washington, D.C., was apparently talking to some very important people who were clearly aware of who he was. And I'm wondering if this ET he saw, I'll call it ET, but I'm thinking it might have been a regular human in a reverse engineered craft. And I say that because of the description of the craft that he provides, the description of this human that he saw, because he said it was essentially a human man who spoke English to him and had such a weird, brief message. Makes me wonder if this man that the witness talked to knew that the witness was very interested in cars and automobiles and vehicles, and that was the purpose of the encounter, to sort of show off and say, oh, you're interested in vehicles, well, look at this one. Because that's essentially what happened. I do think that this, could very well be a encounter that would be with a regular human involving a reverse engineered craft. However, I'm not sure, because what about the fact that it appears, despite what the witness says, that he did have missing time, given that there was no traffic on the road, suspiciously. He's describing exactly what we call the Oz effect. Suddenly he finds himself in a different position on the road, not knowing how he got there. And while he says he didn't have missing time, the encounter occurred at 9 p.m. It was very brief, and he gets to his destination at 11 p.m. That's 2 hours. So I don't know. I didn't have the opportunity to talk to this gentleman. He's now deceased. But this case raises all kinds of questions and sure is unusual. All right, now let's move to the next case. Again, a not very well-known case. I call this one, It Hurt My Eyes to Look at It. This is a single witness case, but it does have some interesting physical evidence to it. This one occurred on the evening of August 8, 1985 in Firenze, Italy. This case comes from Italian researchers Fabrizio Villa and Calogero Orlando of the Italian National Ufological Center. The sole witness is Signora Domenica Cantone, the wife of a police inspector in the Italian Carabinieri, which serves as both the military and police force. She lived with her husband on the 6th floor of an apartment building in Firenze, Italy. Now, August 8, 1985, the night of the encounter, was a very warm night, and Dominica found herself unable to sleep because of the heat. And it was around 3:30 a.m. that she went out onto the balcony of her apartment to get some relief from the heat. And suddenly, off in the distance, she saw a strange craft which quickly began to approach. It moved slowly and silently, coming closer and closer, until it was only just a few meters away from her at eye level. It then stopped, hovering just above the small soccer field next to the building, and it was so close that the witness had an excellent view of this craft and, more importantly, what or who was inside it. For the witness, the strange craft was sort of egg-shaped, surrounded by a silver hue. It had a glass cupola on top of the craft, and inside it she could see two men. They were visible only from the head up. She describes them only as wearing caps which had two large ear-like protrusions on either side of the head. She was actually unsure if these protrusions were actually ears or a part of the cap themselves, but she could see that these two men appeared to be holding a conversation. No sooner had she seen these two figures inside this craft when they stopped talking and turned to gaze fixedly directly at her. Without warning, three landing legs, or arms as she called them, extended from the body of the craft. It appeared to her that the craft was getting ready to land, and this scared her greatly, as she thought that the two beings were planning to abduct her. So she fled in a panic off the balcony into the bedroom of her apartment and tried to wake up her husband and tell him about the UFO. Strangely, he would not wake up. Failing to wake him up, she ran back to the balcony. Only a few moments had passed, but she could now see that the landing legs were retracting back into the craft. These two little figures were still visible and were still staring at her. As the legs finished retracting into the craft, it suddenly darted away at what she called lightning speed. It was still perfectly silent, but it now emitted an intensely bright light, which was so brilliant that, as Domenica described, quote, "It hurt my eyes to look at it." Now, looking at the clock, she could see that it was now 4 a.m., so she had viewed the craft for almost a half hour. Still terrified, she immediately went through the house, shutting all the windows and drawing all the blinds. She went directly back to bed, but was unable to fall asleep for the rest of the night. The encounter affected her so profoundly that in the days and weeks that followed the encounter, despite the summer heat, she slept with all the windows closed. In fact, she planned on getting an air conditioner. It was 2 days following this encounter that some local boys in the area found strange marks in the sports field next to the building, right where she had seen this object, below it, I should say. These strange marks were described as 3 circular imprints, with burned marks in the center and what looked like a grayish powder in the outer area. Now, as word of Domenica's sighting spread and the subsequent marks in the field were discovered, many people came to view the strange marks. Despite the fact that the apartment building was quite large, no other witnesses ever stepped forward. What a fascinating case. It's so interesting to me that this lady sees this UFO at some distance in the sky, and what does it do? It approaches her balcony and basically stops right in front of it. I mean, that has to be intentional. There's no escaping it, given that they looked directly at her. And then it starts to apparently land. So there's obvious intentionality in this case. She ran off. Apparently that was the end of the encounter. But given that there were landing traces found in the field right next to her building, makes it sound like, yeah, that this was more than a simple sighting. This craft apparently landed. Very strange also that this is a pretty populated area and there were no other witnesses, though I have to say that that is not terribly unusual. UFOs can show themselves to who they want to, and other people won't necessarily see them. But I've often said this, and that is one person's sighting is another person's onboard UFO encounter. So maybe they were there to take somebody else. Pure speculation, but I thought I'd bring it up because I think that's an important point. UFOs are coming for a reason. All right, let's move to the last and final case in this collection. Also very, very unusual. I love this case. There's quite a bit to it. I've never heard one quite like it. I call this one Healed by the Little Men. This one occurred on September 2nd, 1988 in Itacaruca, Brazil. This is an amazing case because it's not just a single event. It's actually a series of events with one major encounter. And again, I've got more to say about it, but let's just first present the case. This case comes from prolific and respected Brazilian researcher Irene Granchi. She's president of the Brazilian UFO group CISNE, which stands for the Center of Investigations on the Nature of Extraterrestrials. She's also the author of UFOs and Abductions in Brazil. It was around 4 a.m. on July 31st, 1988, that her son, Ludovico Granchi, was asleep in the bedroom of his home in the coastal town of Itacaruca, Brazil. Suddenly he was awakened by the barking of his 4 dogs, and after quickly looking at his watch and noting the time, he saw that his compass was spinning around wildly. He then looked out his window and saw that the area outside was lit up like daylight. So he rushed out to the living room and opened the window, and he could now see a massive craft flying slowly back and forth above his house. Now Ludovico estimated that the craft was about 100 feet wide, pretty big. It was metallic, leaden gray in color, and shaped, quote, something like a wasp's nest. It was 600 to 700 feet above the ground. It had what appeared to be a large circular opening in the bottom, which was exuding a sort of white vapor which surrounded the craft. Per the witness, this vapor glowed with orange and blue lights, which apparently were coming from the craft itself. But the strangest part of the sighting was yet to come. As the witness says in his own words, "I continued to watch it, and as it passed over the house for the 3rd time, I saw it stop. And suddenly it emitted a brightly lit white panel with writing in black letters on it. The borders of the panel were also black. On impulse, I ran to fetch a pad and pen, and I started to copy down what I saw. This phase must have lasted for about 10 minutes, during which time I did my best to copy faithfully what I was seeing, and as if guided by an invisible hand to take down the message. I cannot tell whether my copy was a faithful one. I was in a panic. It was a strange sensation, as if the world were about to end." So no sooner had he finished copying down these strange symbols when the light on the panel went out and the UFO departed, making a very strange sound, which Ludovico describes as, quote, like that of a rusty handle being turned around and around. And that was it. Now Ludovico does add that as a child in the early 1950s, when he was about 10 years old, he recalls meeting, quote, little people. He doesn't say anything more than that, but he also adds that one day he and his little brother and sister were in the backyard of their home when a UFO came down hovering just above them, actually covering the yard, quote, like a roof. So they began calling out to their mother, Irene, saying, "Mommy, come out quickly. Come and see the flying saucer." Of course she did run out, but by the time she arrived, the only evidence of the craft was a small speck in the sky moving away. But according to Ludovico and his brother and sister, while this ship was hovering overhead, they all felt an intense heat coming from the craft. But really, it was an experience that occurred on September 2nd, 1988, just over 1 month following his encounter on July 31st, that changed Ludovico's life. On that night, he noticed unusual lights in the thick wooded forest behind his house. He described them as, quote, strange little lights, like those given off by glowworms, only larger. So seeing them, he felt almost impelled to go outside and investigate. And as he did so, these little lights gathered together, and at the same time he heard this weird insect-like chirping sound, sort of like crickets or grasshoppers is how he described it. Then, without warning, he found himself surrounded by 5, quote, little men. He said that they had the appearance much like small children. They were about 3 feet 9 inches tall, with white skin, thin arms, dark green eyes, and short ash blonde hair. They were wearing light beige uniforms with what looked to him like thick armor-like vests and boots, which he described as looking almost like fiberglass. So these little men walked around him with normal movements, he said. Each was carrying a small wand-like device with a blinking and pulsating white light on the tip. So Ludovico realized that it was these lights which first caught his attention. And although these lights were bright enough to light up the environment around him, almost like daylight, the lights did not hurt his eyes. Now at this point, one of the little men gently grasped Ludovico's arm and led him to a nearby cave. Inside the cave, which appeared to be brightly lit, Ludovico was placed on a rectangular white stone, like a bed, in the center of this cave. The little men then proceeded to use their wands to examine his body. Now, a few days earlier, prior to this, Ludovico had fallen and gashed his leg on a rusty nail beside a railway line, and this wound was deep and festering. The little men seemed to pay special attention to this wound. Now, during this time, the little men talked among themselves in a weird, unintelligible language which sounded to Ludovico like, quote, chirping like crickets. And hearing this, Ludovico was struck with the idea to ask the little men if they knew his name. And instantly, one of the little men spoke to him with a perfect Portuguese accent, saying Ludovico's name with a shrill voice like that of a small child. Ludovico said the strange beings were very kind and friendly, and after this brief exam, they actually gave him a piece of fruit to eat. Ludovico said it was smooth and red on the outside and lighter colored on the inside, and it smelled and tasted good. He said it was much like a plum, but with an apple-like texture and no visible seeds inside. This ended the encounter, and Ludovico returned to his home, only to discover that the wound on his leg had been healed. He says that for several days following this encounter, he felt somewhat troubled and confused. He also said that he felt as though he was, quote, floating in thin air, and this feeling remained for some time afterwards. Now, his mother, Irene Granchi, interviewed him about 1 week after the encounter and writes, quote, he was looking very pale, quite different from his healthy, normal, sunburnt self. Now, despite several attempts, no one has been able to decipher or translate the strange symbols and signs that Ludovico allegedly received from the UFO on the night of July 31st, 1988. It's also strange that he describes being taken to a brightly lit cave, being laid out on a table with these beings with little wands. This sounds in some ways like, the little folk, fairy folk. But in another way, it looks very much like your standard UFO onboard encounter. Hard to say, but certainly a fascinating case. A lot of interesting details to that case. One I find really intriguing is that the witness's mother, Irene Granchi, is herself a very prominent and well-known and respected UFO researcher. I think a lot of researchers themselves have had encounters. I don't know that Irene ever described her own encounters. I'll have to look that up, but it wouldn't surprise me if she did. But certainly her children apparently have had a number of encounters, particularly Ludovico. So that is so interesting to me. He appears to be a contactee. When you see a craft that close up, when you have visitations as a little kid, these are all the signs we look for in terms of somebody being a contactee. Also fascinating is that he was shown these strange symbols. Again, not unique, but certainly unique in the way he was shown these symbols. I don't know that I've ever heard that before. It's unfortunate that no one has been able to translate these symbols, so I don't know. Perhaps this is just a way to sort of shake the witness up, make him think out of the box, consider new paradigms and new ideas, because I think that is one of the techniques ETs use. They will provide a witness with high strangeness experiences that really cause them to consider new ideas. Again, pure speculation, but certainly interesting, and I think a possibility that we need to consider because there are so many cases that have such weird high strangeness to them. So overall, an important case, I think. I think all of these cases are important. These are just 6, and you know how many cases I've presented on this channel. We're looking at a few thousand now, at least. And there's no shortage of others. I'm always looking for new and amazing cases. And again, I love covering cases that most people haven't heard before. I'm guessing you probably haven't heard of most of these. I don't know. You can let me know. Either way, I want to thank you once again for watching. I truly appreciate it. This subject is so important. I'm so gratified and excited to see that this subject is being taken more and more seriously, that we're seeing steps towards disclosure. We yet have to see officials really admitting that people are having direct contact, but sooner or later, I think they will have to, disclosure will happen. I think it's inevitable for one simple fact: UFOs are real. And while you can hide the truth, you can lie about it, you can distort it, you can ignore it, you will never destroy it. So yeah, thank you again. Hope you enjoyed this episode. Until next time, keep asking those hard questions, keep looking for the truth. Most important of all, keep having fun. And I will see you next time on UFOs and the Paranormal. Bye for now.